Today's How to Code Well podcast is brought to you in part by Hostinger. Go to hostinger.com/Peter Fisher to get 91% off your web hosting. Use the discount code Peter Fisher at checkout. Links in the show notes below. Hello coders and welcome to the first episode of season 3 of the How to Code Well podcast. I'm joined by Jeremy Onion. Hi Jeremy, how have you had a good week?
Yes, it's been a very good week. Thank you very much. Awesome. How are you yourself?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. It's a bit of a weird one because we're actually recording this in December before Christmas. So I can't ask you how your Christmas has been because Christmas is in a few days' time.
Yep.
So I really appreciate you coming on because I know that you're super busy. And today we want to talk about the first things that one should learn when they get into web development. That's the topic of today's show. So let's start by asking, what should new developers learn first? Should it be a framework or should it be a language?
So I know there's a lot of debate about this in various mediums. My personal feeling is you should always learn the language first.
Right.
Learning a framework is absolutely fine to some extent. So particularly if you're using something like Drupal or WordPress or Angular, but the instant something goes wrong and it's not doing what you should, you're completely lost.
Right.
If you understand and you learn from the language upwards, so then you are going to be in a position where when you're trying to put a custom field on a template in WordPress and it's not working, you can actually dive into the code and you can understand what's going on. So you've got a much better chance of being able to resolve any issues. It'll also help you with understanding possibly why frameworks work in the way they do. Because if there are some peculiarities of the underlying language, PHP, for example, there are some interesting ways that you compare items. So when you're comparing two variables, it goes through some interesting rules before it gets to a valid comparison, including typecasting in certain ways. If you don't understand some of these things that are within language, that can trip you up when you're actually working with the framework. So I think personally, I feel that you need that basic understanding. You don't have to necessarily be an expert in the language by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But if you don't know it at all, you are really going to struggle as soon as things get a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. It's like you need to learn the fundamentals before you can appreciate the frameworks. And I see this a lot with new devs where they will learn the language through the eyes of the framework. So instead of appreciating how the language works, it's how it is manipulated through the framework.
Yes.
So there are a lot of methods or classes or objects or what have you in these languages that do a lot of things, like for instance the array functions in PHP, and yet there are frameworks who do the same thing. I'm comparing things here for like jQuery versus JavaScript, that kind of thing, where there are things in JavaScript that can select elements, and there are other ways of doing it in jQuery. And I bring jQuery up because jQuery isn't as popular as it used to be. So if you've learned to code through jQuery and you don't understand JavaScript, then you're going to have a problem when jQuery isn't as popular when you want to move to another project. Is this the case though with both backend and front-end languages and frameworks?
I would say so, and there's a similar thing if you look at, say, Drupal. So Drupal version 7 was very much Drupal. It's its own entity. As soon as you migrate to version 8, it's built on top of Symfony, and it's a lot more composer driven. Although you could use Composer with version 7 if you wanted to. So the framework itself is changing a lot, but the tools that you're using, like Symfony and Composer, if you are a general purpose PHP developer as well, you're going to already have a head start on understanding those tools and how they work, particularly Composer, because I don't know of many reasons not to utilize it nowadays within PHP. It's pretty much ubiquitous. If you're a PHP developer, you should probably understand and know how to use Composer, even if it's just to use libraries to make your job easier.
So that's an interesting point. One I would like to pick apart is, so Composer, NPM, Ruby gems, all of that stuff. When should a developer learn those?
As soon as you get to the point where you're doing something that requires some sort of library of that type. So if when you're starting off and you're doing simple Hello World applications and things like that, you're probably not going to need Composer or an NPM or anything like that, because you're using native stuff within the language. As soon as you start to progress beyond that, so say maybe you're doing a PHP project and you're actually starting to consume an API, so you're getting stuff from the internet and you're doing something with it, talking to other platforms. Or maybe you're doing some more complex form validation in the front end, or you're doing more complicated graphic stuff. That's when you'll probably start looking for libraries initially to help you do what you're doing. Because one of the key things about a good developer is good developers are lazy. I've had lots of conversation with lots of people about this, and they say, what do you mean they're lazy? A good developer won't rewrite code if they don't have to. They will reuse stuff they can do. So you start to think and you start to work in a modular way as you become more experienced. And one of the key things there is, if there's a library out there that's already does what you need and it's being maintained by hundreds of other people, it's being used by hundreds more people, it makes sense to use that, because you're you. Or maybe you're part of a small team if you're lucky. So that, 5, 10, 15, there might be slightly more of you. If you compare that with an open source project that's probably being used by thousands of people, being maintained, hundreds of people can put pull requests in for it. They'll have found all the bugs. They'll have written it for you. So they'll have done a lot of the hard work, and then you can utilize their work. But it's not to say you shouldn't give credit to people, and you should always give back, even just helping with documentation or something like that. Right. There's a whole load of stuff you can do to help open source projects, even if you're just beginning and you don't feel confident as a coder.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And it's always good to give back. But you probably, as soon as you go beyond, where you have a need for a library or there's something out there that will help, then that's probably the time where you should start learning about these things.
So this is the not invented here sort of headspace, isn't it? This thing of this package is already out there, so why spend time rebuilding it? However, when you are starting out, it's probably best to build things yourself rather than use the tools that are available, use the packages that are already there.
I'd say you probably want to get balance. Yeah. So you need to understand enough of the basics to be able to understand what the package is doing. So if you're going to use a package, look into it, try and understand what it's doing, but also be careful about which packages you're using and for what reason. So there was an issue a little while ago with NPM where a simple JavaScript function that everybody was using, I think it was trim or something like that.
It was left pad, I believe.
That's the one, yeah. Something that's very easy to do natively.
Yeah.
Everybody was using it. They removed it from NPM. All these websites suddenly wouldn't build anymore. And that was using something for the sake of using it, because it is so easy to do something like that. So it's about balance, and so much in this industry is, don't use a library just for the sake of it. Use it for a good reason. But also you should definitely have an understanding of what the library is doing, and you should look at the code as well. There have been, and this is going on a little bit from someone just starting out, but it's something that should be in your mind. There was a big hack with the BA website a little while ago. A lot of credit cards data was harvested. My understanding is that was down to an NPM module, one that had been infected with malware, that was pulled in and utilized. So, in the back of your mind, you need to be understanding, what does this do? Because, if you do, go into web development, you end up working for, a larger company, and you're dealing with things like, personal details. It doesn't have to be credit card. It could be, just personal details. It could be medical information. There are a lot of different things you could be dealing with. Mm-hmm. You have to understand whether or not, the libraries you're using, if you are going to use that, have got issues or are malicious. So yeah, there has to be that understanding there, definitely. And also there are, certainly with Composer, if you're then starting to, again, we're moving on a lot from your beginning, but with Composer you can do things like set up your auto loading classes and things like that. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot that you can do with these libraries other than just pull in other libraries and things like that. So that's another thing to do is if you are using Composer, NPM, or anything like that, learn about it and learn the full suite of what it can do and what it's capable of, not just just the bits that are on Stack Overflow for the problem you're trying to solve.
Not just Composer require. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, something that I would add is that Composer is essentially, well, one of the good things for Composer is the fact that it does the auto-loading, as you mentioned. But auto-loading itself is a concept that needs to be learned.
Yes.
And so I would advise not to learn Composer until I understand what auto-loading actually is. Same with NPM, knowing how to import modules. You can create your own modules in JavaScript and learn how modules work without having to use NPM to use other things. So you could create your own little components and modules and bits and pieces. And also things like I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between back-end developers and front-end developers, because it's very different as to how one starts to learn, I think, because with front-end devs, you're dealing with what I call the major three. You've got the CSS, the HTML, and the JavaScript.
Yes.
With the back-end devs, you're dealing with databases, data structures. You're dealing with HTTP requests and responses. You're dealing with server-sided languages, and so it can be a bit tricky to sort of work out what needs to be learnt first for both a front end and a back end developer. I think that with front end devs, there are so many things to learn for getting the front end to work. Not only the code, but also the user experience and all of that stuff as well. The actual theory behind clicking buttons and what happens when that happens.
Yes.
And then with the back end, you've got, security, data management, and all of that other stuff, sessions and all that jazz. So what should a developer choose if they're going for a front end? Where should they start? And then we'll talk about it from the back end point of view.
So it's interesting, and there's a problem here because nowadays if you look at things like single page apps and things like that, and then you start to look at offline storage. There's so much crossover now between the two fields. I don't think it's as easy to separate them anymore as it used to be.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you're using Vue or React or something like that, you can. There are certainly in Vue there's something called SQLize, which is a ORM system for Vue. So you're already starting to get into database, data schemas, things like that. You've got, you're doing REST calls in reverse effectively, but you're still doing that sort of thing when you're doing single page apps as well. So I'd say that the line is blurred quite a bit there. I think probably the first thing you're going to have to learn no matter what is going to be HTML and CSS. Because you can't get your layouts built on the front end without those. So those, and understanding CSS properly, including how weightings work and things like that, is difficult, but that's going to be a fundamental, because it doesn't matter if you're then using JavaScript or you're generating everything using PHP or Python or using Gatsby or any of those systems. If you can't create the HTML structure of your page, and if you can't style it up using CSS, you're already on a losing streak, and you probably want to consider backend, maybe if you're determined to be a developer. Design and UI UX interaction is a whole nother field, and you can do that without being able to code, and you can code without being able to do that. If you're interested in that side of things, or if you're just doing stuff by yourself, there are a lot of great resources out there for learning about UI UX. Udemy do some good courses. I believe Code Academy does some courses about that as well. But that's a whole specialism in itself. I'd say JavaScript probably comes a bit further down the line than those two, because you have to be able to do the basics and the fundamental. Then you're probably going to want to learn JavaScript, possibly jQuery off the back of that initially, because there you can start creating web pages, you can start doing the animations, the interactions, things like that, without having to learn a framework and being taken down a specific path, because one of the key things you want to do as a developer, and you're going to want to come on to this a bit later on, is don't just have one tool in your toolbox. If you ever taken your car in for a service, you don't see a mechanic with just a hammer and doing everything on your car with just a hammer. It's the right tool for the right job. Yeah, you use a screwdriver when you're trying to unscrew a screw. You use spanners when you've got nuts. It's the same with web development. You use the right tools for the job. Well, like I said, I know you want to unpack that a bit more later on as well. But getting the JavaScript in, so you can learn to do stuff like that, and then maybe jQuery on top of that.
Gotcha.
I'd say those should be, if you want to get into front end developer, those are the three key. That's the trinity of things you need to learn.
Yeah,
it's HTML and CSS first. Right. Because they give your page structure and they give you page layout and everything else. And then finally JavaScript on top of that.
Totally agree. I totally agree with that. And I agree with the fact that JavaScript can be ran on the back end, and therefore it's actually quite muddied the water there.
Yes.
It's not as clear cut as I first said, but the thing is, with JavaScript, if you take away the fact that JavaScript can run in Node and you need to learn Node in order to do that, you first need to learn JavaScript, and therefore you need to understand how JavaScript works on the client rather than on the back end. Yeah.
But also, a browser is a good tool for learning and prototyping and doing stuff with JavaScript anyway. Yeah. Especially in the console. You've got debugger built into that. You got the ability to interrogate what's going on while you're stopped and things like that. So, definitely JavaScript, you should learn the front end uses of it first.
Should a back end developer, though, should they learn HTML and CSS before they learn PHP or Python?
I think they can learn it. It depends on what they're doing and how they're going to do it. I think every developer should understand HTML and to some extent CSS. Because at the very least, the chances are you're going to be outputting some HTML snippets at some point. And if you don't understand how classes are applied at the very least, or how selectors work and things like that, then it's going to make it just more difficult for the front end dev if you've got it split like that. Quite a few roles nowadays are looking for full stack developers, which means that there will be some element of understanding the front end that's required. And even if you're thinking, well, I only write APIs, then I will almost guarantee that back end is going to have an admin page somewhere. So you're going to be able to log in and change things. Chances are that's still going to fall under your remit. So, even if you're not able to do parallax scrolling in CSS or CSS-based animations or something like that, having that fundamental understanding of this is the structure of a HTML page. This is how CSS is applied. This is how I get my form looking like it was done by someone who knows what they're doing, not just a bog standard developer, which is what my admin pages look like. To be perfectly honest, I'm not good at front end stuff. I tend to be back end anyway. But I do understand front end. I do understand how it all works. I'm just not very good at making it look nice.
So I think that's the difference between like understanding and using it to having an appreciation and some knowledge of it, right? So like for example, there's certain things in front end stuff that I am aware of. I've read articles on, but I've never actually written any code using such a library or such a framework. But I've got half an eye on it, and I think this is something that developers just have to do, because the world of web development is changing and evolving so much. And you mentioned earlier that Drupal moving on to Symfony stuff. Well, that might change, like in the future. Nobody knows what's going to happen in 5 years' time. Nobody knows if React is going to still be around or if Vue is going to be around, because these weren't around 10 years ago, right? So you can't, it's very difficult to put all of your eggs in this one basket. It's always good to be aware of what's happening. It's like on the provisional, your views, what could be coming up around the corner. So in your opinion, what is the quickest way that someone could, if they were listening to this and they thought, oh, you know what, my New Year's resolution is to learn to code, what would the first thing you say be for, to them as to, how would they start? What would you suggest?
I think the key thing for development, front end or back end, is to actually do it. You're not. You can get some information by watching videos, reading books, listening to podcasts. There's a wealth of information out there, but unless you're actually doing it, you're not going to get it. And you need to start with the fundamentals. It's definitely, like we've already said, a case of start with the languages. So you can use things like, I know as on How to Code Well, you've got a few projects that you're doing where you're taking people through from the beginning of, this is the problem we're trying to solve and this is how we're doing it, and introducing design patterns and good practices like that. Those sort of things are absolutely fantastic to do, along with things like code challenges or tutorials. The key thing is try to find something that gets you to actually do it yourself and not just talks at you. And give it a go. Ask people, if you know people in the industry, to critique your code. That's good to do as well. Be careful about who you ask, though. And if you ever get to a point where you're critiquing other people's code, remember that you started at some point as well. So be constructive. Not just what are you doing this, you idiot? Don't go down that route. That's not good. So that's why you have to be a little bit careful about who you ask to critique your code. Make sure it's someone who can be constructive and helpful and not just, putting you down. And remember, everybody started out. Nobody came out of the womb knowing how to code. We've all learnt and we've all got where we are through practice, making mistakes, fixing them. If everybody wrote perfect code, we wouldn't have things like XDebug. It just doesn't happen. We wouldn't bother with unit tests. Everything would be hunky-dory. That's not how things work. So get in there and actually just try it. And, if you've got a computer, then you've already got all the tools you need to be able to develop. You've got a number of IDEs you can download to use. I know people that still code in Notepad. So you don't need all of these fancy tools, although there are a lot of good tools out there to help you. I remember when I started out, YouTube wasn't a thing. Tutorials online weren't a thing. So it was very much just try it. And I think one of the other key things that will help is if you try and find a problem to solve, but it's something that you're interested in or you really enjoy. Now, it doesn't matter if there's already someone else has done something that solves that same problem, because there are 101 task list managers out there. There are invoicing platforms out there. There are blogs, blog platforms out there. You may have heard of something called WordPress. That's quite good for blogs. But that shouldn't stop you. Just because someone else has already done it, this shouldn't stop you trying, so that you can get an understanding of how these systems fit together. Start off small. So start off with something like maybe a simple task list. Something that you can maybe put the tasks in and possibly rearrange them on the screen. Now, if you can drag and drop your list to order it, and you've got that stored in a database somewhere, you've covered off an awful lot of functionality there. You can then sort of expand, and then maybe you can have it. I'll have it either email me a reminder or send me a push notification. There's so much you can then do to extend these things.
Yeah.
But don't go big straight away either. Start off small. Start off with I'd love to be able to solve this problem. Let's break it down. Let's do this tiny bit first and slowly build up to it.
Well, it's remarkable how small things that they seem small on the offset are actually huge. They're actually ginormous. Yeah, because then you start, you're considering all sorts of aspects of not only the user journey, but how the data is stored, what happens when this button's pressed, and, all of this stuff.
The interactions are, validations,
exactly,
whether that then fires off another process.
Yeah.
Whenever anybody says to me, and we still get this a lot with clients and things like that, but it's just a button.
Yeah, I bet.
And then there's quite a, depending on who I'm talking to, but there will quite often be a large list of things that have to be thought about for that button to appear there.
Yeah.
So it is, and it does start to it can quite quickly unpack from a simple what seems like a simple little challenge to all of this massive stuff that you maybe just didn't think of. And then all of a sudden, as you're doing it, you think, oh no, what happens when I do that? All right, I'm going to have to look at that now, and I'm going to have to work out how this impacts this over here. Especially if you're quite tightly coupled as well, because you change something over here, and then something over here is suddenly broken. You're thinking, hang on. What happened there?
Yeah, I find web development it's a very weird thing to learn, because you have to be comfortable accepting the fact that you're not ever going to learn all of it.
I'm not.
But as long as you've got that curiosity, that itch that you want to scratch every time you wake up and you go, hang on a minute, this is something that is new here. This is something I'm learning here.
It's a want to improve as well.
Yeah.
So it's it's this idea that you're not just going to stick with the status quo. You want to improve things. You want to make things better. You want to take something and just give it that little extra bit of an extra bit of functionality, or a bit of polish, or just make it work in a slightly different way. And that's the thing. It doesn't have to be a whole brand new thing. It can just be a small improvement, a small iterations.
That is the key. It's small iterations, increments that get that improve the project over time, like a fine wine. So we mentioned earlier about eggs in baskets and many programming languages.
Yes.
Let's start by talking about so let's say you've started on your journey and you've decided to learn a bit of HTML. When should one go, I'm going to learn JavaScript now, or I'm going to learn CSS now?
I'd say with those two, it's as soon as you have a need for it. So once you've got say a form on a web page, because the standard styling in most browsers isn't too bad now, you might suddenly think, do you know what? I can submit this to my PHP, but I want quicker feedback for the user if they've typed in a password that doesn't meet the criteria.
Yeah.
That's the point where you want to introduce JavaScript.
Okay.
So as soon as there is a need to do so, that's probably when you want to introduce that language, or that part of a language. So the same with CSS. I've now written this JavaScript. I've got a form that tells you when things are wrong, but it doesn't look very pretty. So then you're going to start looking at, how do I style it up? How do I make it look better? What other things can I do? Likewise, with your homepage, you're probably thinking, do you know what? It'd be nice if this came whooshing here as I scroll down, and all this sort of stuff. And using other sites for inspiration as well is a good way. So if you're seeing that, a site that you like the look of manages to achieve something, then that's the time where you want to go investigating, right, how did they achieve that? How can I do that? What do I need to learn to do that?
Right.
Because, it could be that they've done it in JavaScript, in CSS, it could be something else that they've used to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that if you're not careful in learning the right things in the right order, when you're starting out at least, then it can give you a negative skew on certain ways the languages and frameworks and libraries will hang together. So for example, if if you go, oh, I'm going to learn JavaScript. I've never learned JavaScript before, but I'm going to learn JavaScript, but I'm going to do it in React. I'm going to learn React. I'm going to learn how to create React components. Yes. I'm going to learn to create CSS in JavaScript.
Yeah.
You then have that sort of knowledge that CSS is part of JavaScript. It's not actually something separate. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying at all that CSS shouldn't be in JavaScript, but I just think that there is a danger of not being aware of the actual fundamentals of where these programming languages start and finish.
Yeah. Well, this is the key thing as to why it needs to be when you have that need. Yeah. Because if you're going to do something like put the CSS in the JavaScript, which, like I said, for certain use cases is perfectly acceptable. Mm-hmm. You have to understand why you're doing that and what you're doing that for and what's the reasoning behind that. So this is where you build up to it. So you start off with, right, I need to put some validation on here. How do I achieve that? It's a nice specific defined goal, and you look for, because you're a good developer, so you're lazy, it's the path of least resistance. What's the easiest way to achieve this? Now, it's not going to be the entire React framework. It's going to be at most a library, or write something yourself. Mm-hmm. And by writing something yourself natively, you'll actually understand what's going on. Or if you are going to use a library, make sure you understand it. Going back to what I said before, don't use code if you don't understand what it does. The same with Stack Overflow. If you search for, solutions online, and we all do it, I don't think there's a single developer that hasn't at some point looked to Google, I don't understand what's going on here. What am I doing wrong? Mm-hmm. Make sure that anything you see, you step through and you actually understand what's going on, because otherwise you've not helped yourself. All you've done is introduce code that you can't maintain, you can't change, and you can't explain what's going on, to someone else if necessary.
Definitely.
So you definitely need to do that. It's a bit like, it's akin to if I was learning to, say, fly glider. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've got my glider's license. I'm able to take an unpowered flight machine up, and someone releases the tow rope. I know all about rising on thermals, and I can go a distance, I can land it properly. Brilliant. Mm. I can't then go and straight away pilot the space shuttle down from space. It's the same concept. It's still a plane. Yeah. It's still got wings. It's still using aerodynamics to be able to, maintain a glide path. But other than that, no, they're completely different. And that's the thing. You have to build up to these things. Mm. If you ever, if you do decide, or if you ever looked into doing your private pilot's license, you start off with being able to fly in good visibility on a single engine plane. Mm-hmm. And then you have to add more things to your license. Multi-engine, well, that's an additional test because there's additional skills you need. Flying by instrument, so you can fly at night or in bad weather. Oh, that's an additional test. You want to go from propeller to jet engine? Oh, that's an additional one. And you have to build up. And the same with web development. You can't expect, I know how to traverse an array in JavaScript, so I can now write a React application. It doesn't work like that. You have to build up to it, and you have to learn these steps. And it's possible. It's all possible. And anybody can do this, as long as you have the right mindset while you're doing it. Yeah. But you have to build up to it. Don't expect, just because you've learned some JavaScript and you know how to build a web page, that you can suddenly write a single page app. It takes time, but you can get there. Just make sure that you give yourself the time to do it.
Oh, I definitely agree. What's your opinion on this in the context of backend stuff? So let's say, for example, a dev's been working on some PHP for the past 6 months or whatever, and then decides maybe they would like to learn a bit of Python. When should you do that? I'd say there are probably two reasons for learning an additional language to the ones you know. One is that you are finding that the language you're using, you're having to do things in such a convoluted way to achieve the results you want. The chances are there's going to be a better tool out there. There are certain things that Python does very well that PHP doesn't, and vice versa. So there are good reasons for using both, and the same with Ruby. Ruby can be quite opinionated in some ways, but if you're trying to do something quickly and rapidly, then Ruby can quite often be a lot quicker because it will do a lot for you in the background, particularly if you're using Rails. So I would say one of the reasons would be for because the language you're using just doesn't seem suited for what you're trying to do.
RNF particularly fall into this category. So they're quite specialist languages for mathematics and things like that. So you wouldn't want to use those if you're just trying to do form validation or you're trying to just save something to a database. But if you're doing stuff involving complex equations and things like that, then they're probably something you'd want to look at. Mm-hmm. And there are specialist language out there for certain domains. Mm-hmm. So that would probably be the other reason for looking at a language if you're moving into a specialist area or domain. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you're starting to look at robotics and automation, then you're probably going to look at Rust or something like that as a language. And, Google will tell you about lots of different languages for lots of different domains. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the other reason. The other one would be curiosity. So that kind of makes free. Although I kind of put the domain-specific language in the best tool for the job kind of bucket. So if you're just for the pure fun of it, if you want to learn a bit of Python or understand a bit of maybe you've got some friends that are using Python or Perl even. If you want to stretch your mind about that far,
gosh,
and you want to find out what the heck they're talking about, then getting into trying things in a different way. It also helps you sometimes approach things in a different way as well, because if you move to using a different language and it has a very different way of thinking about things, sometimes you can then apply that to the language you were using. Mm-hmm. There's an idea that some people have. I don't know whether it's true or not, but if you've got a dog, as you and I both do, sometimes when you talk to them, they'll turn their head to one side,
right,
as if trying to kind of understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And there is some scientific basis that says a problem from a different viewpoint, which could be as simple as tilting your head. This is kind of where the rubber duck debugging technique comes from as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Then that'll get you thinking in a different way, and sometimes you'll find a different solution to the same problem just by having a different viewpoint. So this is why sometimes we'll be working on a problem, you go away from your desk, and all of a sudden it'll be, bang, I know what the problem is. You can come back and fix it. It's this whole perspective thing. And having a different language or the understanding of how different languages work and different syntax and things like that sometimes can give you that, that inspiration moment to solving a problem as well.
I agree.
So I know there's a lot of communities where a lot of people are like, you got to use PHP. It's the best one. And other people are like, PHP is shit. Use Python.
Yeah.
Don't listen to them at all.
No.
Learn as many possible. It's like I said with the mechanic analogy. Have as many tools as you've got, then you're going to have a better tool for the job or the best tool for the job. Mm-hmm. Don't assume that it's one size fits all with any. It's the same with frameworks on the front end. It's languages, it's anything at all. Databases, operating systems. You can apply this to absolutely anything. Even cloud providers. They all do certain things very well, and there are other things they don't necessarily do as well as some of the other options. So the more you know about all of them, the more chance you've got of picking the better tool for the job, but also the better your breadth of knowledge of how to solve certain problems are. So that if you are stuck in one language, it may give you some insight necessary to help you resolve the issues you're having.
You said earlier about Perl, and
That's back a fair way.
I remember writing Perl.
Yes.
Can't remember why I did it. Is there anything that you've learned or concerned yourself with when you were starting out, which you wish you didn't?
Yeah, this is an interesting question as well. So WYSIWYG editors was probably a mistake I made. So front page in the earlier versions of Dreamweaver, because it's the same. I guess it's kind of the same reason why you don't learn a framework or something like that first. It hides too much of what's going on from you. Mm-hmm. So if you ever, I don't even know if you can get front page nowadays. But if you ever use even just a tiny MCE, for instance, or I'm going to kind of swear now, using Word to generate a HTML document. So if you ever do something in Word and then export it as HTML and you look at the code it generates, it is not easy to work with, to put it politely. And this was part of the problem with WYSIWYG editors. You could get things laid out quite nicely, but then when you dive into the code and try and understand, and you got to remember this is before CSS was really that powerful. Mm-hmm. So 9 times out of 10 you'd end up using a table for layout and things like that. So it wasn't particularly good. It didn't, certainly wasn't responsive.
Yeah.
But it wasn't too much of a problem because most people just had an 800 by 600 monitor anyway. Going back a bit.
The old
now.
CRTs, yeah.
Exactly. So that side of it wasn't necessarily so much of an issue, but you really didn't understand necessarily what was going on. And anything that hides what's going on from you is not good for you as a developer, because it's difficult to learn what's going on. So you wouldn't be able to, if I was to do a layout in, say, front page, and then look at the code and try and understand what's going on, very, very difficult, as opposed to if I'd coded it myself, because then I understand exactly what's happening. But also it will do things in such a way that aren't necessarily best practice or that good. So that hiding stuff from you, and you then, it doesn't help you as a developer to learn about what's going on. So I'd say you probably want to, and there is an argument in general for avoiding IDEs initially when you're first learning to code and sticking with something like maybe Sublime or Notepad or another simple editor. I don't necessarily subscribe to that idea myself. I think that it's good to learn how to use these tools quite quickly, as long as you don't miss out on learning the fundamentals of how the language works. So you have to be disciplined enough to make sure you don't rely on the IDE too much.
That's,
initially.
very good points. Yeah.
But I don't think that there's an issue with that, because there's so much out there like, Xdebug and things like that can really help you with coding. And particularly as you get you into doing more stuff. But certainly WYSIWYG editors, that's something that I wish I'd just never even bothered with. It really was. That's probably for me. Other than that, I don't think anything else where I learned something and it didn't work, I don't see as a failure, because I learned, if nothing else, I learned that doesn't work. So it improved my knowledge anyway. The WYSIWYG thing just didn't improve my knowledge. That was something that just made life more difficult, and I didn't gain, my net gain was nothing other than sinking time into unpicking stuff and trying to relearn how things work, or trying to learn it anyway separately. So
yeah. I mean, I think for me, so I've learned a load of stuff that doesn't really exist anymore. Like I mentioned, Perl, ActionScript.
Yep.
And there's other things, but I think that I wouldn't look upon them as something that I would regret. I think I would look upon them as something that I needed to learn at the time. And it gives me the attitude of what I'm coding in now may never exist in a few years' time. There's always, and the weird thing with ActionScript was it was, because it was Flash, and Apple decided to put the nail in the coffin with Flash. It was an influence from a company that really prevented Flash from, Flash has obviously a whole bunch of other problems as well for security and stuff like that. But it was very fascinating. It was like, this is actually being influenced by and manipulating by companies that are, trying to have their own agenda and other things like that. So it was like a real sort of wake up call that just because you're in your nice little comfort zone, it doesn't mean that can be shattered by something completely external. Yeah.
And it doesn't have anything to do with the popularity of the platform you're using, or the, how suitable it is for the job that you're doing, or any of that sort of stuff. It can, it can. I mean, you look at things like, going a bit further afield, so JavaScript, .NET, things like that.
Yeah.
They're all competing technologies. They all do their jobs very well. But if Microsoft were to decide to suddenly change .NET in some way, shape or form, or, supersede that with something else, not a lot you can do about that.
No.
It's, it's out of your hands as a developer.
Yeah.
And this is why having a number of tools available, to your fingertips is important, because if there are issues where, certain technologies get deprecated, or, there is a new flavor of the month, or there's a split in the community, for example, which has happened with a number of open source projects, which have then led to, there being competing versions of effectively the same platform. And, OpenOffice and LibreOffice are, a good example of that, where there was community, there wasn't alignment on where the project was going. So it split. So there were then two versions of the same product. It's happened with quite a few, and it will continue to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah.
From if you can think back to when you started,
well, that's pushing it.
Are you able to compare the methods in which you learned how to code then compared to how you are learning now? Is there any fundamental changes?
Yes. So when I first started to learn to code, you have to remember there wasn't YouTube or anything like that. Even the internet itself was, it was mainly dial-up, not terribly quick dial-up as well. So a lot of my learning came from books and things like that. So they were, so there's kind of a trade-off there. So they were books, so they were written and edited, so they were good technical volumes, which is fantastic. But it was all written text. There was no demo. They had sample code in there, but obviously I had to type it in unless you were lucky enough to have a floppy disk or then a CD-ROM with the code on, which you could then load in.
Wow.
To some extent, that kind of worked as a bit of an advantage because it meant you actually had to type the code in. And I think that by actually typing in code and understanding what's going on, that can help solidify your learning. Certainly when I started, there were, Rocks and Sams, things like that. Learn something in 24 hours. That was not initially how I got into it. And when you compare that with now with things like Coursera, which are where you got courses done by universities, some of which are free, some of which are paid for, but you have peer marking quite often. So certain courses I've done, you submit your code and then you have other people on the course evaluating your code, obviously checking it's running as well, but critiquing what you've done. To things like Codecademy, where you're actually filling in the code there and then into the browser. To all the tutorials like how to code well and what have you on YouTube, where you've got access to a wealth of information, some of it good, some of it bad. But you've got so much access to stuff, and I find now that I used to be quite happy learning from books. That never used to be an issue for me. I'd quite happily read it. I'd take it in, and I'd be able to work with that, no problem. Nowadays, I find that I much prefer videos and actually doing it myself. So, even if it's a video about something, I'll quite often be stopping it, trying out something myself in my IDE. Trying different things, or if they show a way to do something, I'll quite often then start changing it and seeing what else I can do with that code and maybe that pattern and things like that. I still use books occasionally, but they tend to be more reference type books. So something like the Gang of Four design patterns, I quite often refer back to that. Clean Coder and Clean Code are good books to go back and revisit every so often. But a lot more of it is done by that, and things like coding dojos and things like that are quite good as well. So the way you've got a simple coding challenge that you can then use. A really good one I did not too long ago is writing something using test-driven development. Write something to encode integers as Roman numerals.
Okay. Right.
It's really good. It's really easy because you can start off with I1, that's I. 2, I. Oh, I like this. I just keep adding an I on as I count through the number. Okay, 5 is V. I can manage that. Okay, 4 is IV. Bugger. It's the I. And then, simple things like that. You can start to get really carried away with things like that. So, and again, there are a lot of websites online. And I think this is the thing. There's so much wealth of information online that you can really, for any learning style that you have, you can really pick something that works well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a paid for platform to be good quality either. So I've done some paid for stuff that I thought this is just not really up to spec. No. And why did I waste this money on this? And I've come across free training and videos and things like that have been really good, really professional, really thought provoking, and really learned a lot from. So, it's very much your mileage may vary, but yeah, having gone from just being able to buy a book to almost at my fingertips, particularly with Google, find answers to lots of problems and lots of things. It's definitely been a massive change. And I think these interactive courses like Codecademy are very, very, very good as well, because, you've got the code, you're doing the code there. It will tell you where your bugs are quite often. Yeah. And it's all part of the course. So it's not just someone telling you and then you have to go off and do it yourself and see if it works. It's all there for you. Mm.
Interesting. Yeah. Before we shoot off, is there any advice that you can give to aspiring devs, people who are listening to this and going, oh, this sounds really, really good. I'm going to learn to code this year.
First, most important, get stuck in. You're not going to learn anything without doing it. So there's a wealth of IDEs and tools out there. If you've got a computer, it's very easy to set up, say, WAMP or MAMP. Or a virtual machine. There are a lot of tutorials that will take you through doing this anyway. But just get stuck in. You're only going to learn, and you're only going to learn whether or not you like this and whether or not you've got an aptitude for doing this by trying it. There are a lot of nice, easy tutorials on there. Find some good tutorials that take you through the basics as well. So don't go straight in thinking, I'm going to create a XYZ app. Hear this a lot. People talk about a hello world. That's the first thing they do, and there's a reason for that. Partly it's to make sure that everything is working properly. So if you want a web page to pop up with "Hello World," then you need to have your web server or whatever you're using to do the page. Sure. It has to be working. Your browser has to be there. But also because that's a first step in the language, getting it to give you some sort of response so it's working. And then you can build on that. And then you can build baby steps, do a little bit at a time, just to build your knowledge slowly. And don't get discouraged if things don't work first time. Right. Because that happens to all of us. It isn't easy. If it was easy, then you'd be able to do it without having to learn and without having to try. As you get more experience, you wouldn't then be very opinionated on how things should be done. If it was easy, it would just work. So it is hard. It isn't always going to just fall into place, but it's part of the attraction is the problem solving element as well. And there's nothing like the satisfaction of, suddenly after 2 hours thinking, that's it. That's why it's not working. You make your fix and it works and everything's fine again.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
It's good fun.
Yeah, it's getting that feedback loop. It's getting that quick feedback. The hello world is such a quick thing to throw out and do. Yeah. And that's like the first tick. It's like, I got that working. Awesome. On to the next thing. Brilliant. Yeah. So this is the first episode of season 3, and what I've decided to do is change up the end of question. Last year we did, I'm going to say last year, even though it is this year because we're doing the anyway. So the last season's question was to do with if you could talk to oneself, in say your previous experience, what would you say? What advice would you give? This one's slightly different. This is if you could spend time learning something that isn't coding, what would it be and why?
Okay. So I've got kind of two answers to this. One is a professional one. Okay. For career development, and the other one is a personal one. Okay. So in terms of for professional ones for career development, I think what I want to try and concentrate on this year is going to be around leadership skills, mainly about things like career development for people that work for me, not for myself. And appraisals, and how to be effective at coaching. So I do try and do this anyway, because it's part of my thoughts on what a good manager leader should be. However, I'm aware there's always stuff to learn, and there are always better ways to do things or more efficient ways to do things. So that's kind of, for me, that's that from a career development. That's kind of my focus now. Is, you know, part of me, you know, being in the position I am, I'm a little bit removed from the coding anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's about that piece about, you know, how do I get the best and how do I bring on other people and mentor better and all that sort of stuff. So that's that side of it. From a personal level, it's probably more around cookery.
Oh, right. Wow.
Particularly things like, I'd love to be able to make sushi properly.
Right.
And I'd love to be able to do more authentic dishes from other regions like Asian, Indian, Southern European, and things like that. So if this was a kind of a wish thing and I could do anything I wanted with my time, I'd love to spend time traveling and working in kitchens to learn how to cook regional dishes properly. So not the, you know, you get a pack from the supermarket and you just follow the instructions, but actually, you know, from basics, you know, how in Thailand would they go about making a proper Thai green curry or something like that. Right. So that would be, from a personal thing, that would be what I'd love to do.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, I can see this question is going to be, there's going to be some awesome answers on this season.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to have to answer. I think the other thing is with the cooking, you can learn so much about a culture just through the cooking,
right? Yeah,
through the way they eat and the way they prepare things, and you know, understand about what ingredients are plentiful, what aren't. So that, you know, every region has its own staples of the sort of food, and that it's just absolutely fascinating, and it gives a potted history as well.
Right. So you would be totally absorbed in the culture and you know, why they've done it, how they've done it, the tools they use. Awesome.
Yeah, the techniques they use, and you know, you might start to spot that. Well, you know, the South American cuisine obviously will be influenced by Spanish cuisine,
right?
But the other influences that come in. So you know, well, we use this cooking technique, which is traditionally more sort of northern Africa and things like that, and all those sort of things.
Oh, wonderful.
So, cooking is a fascinating subject when you get into it, and it's not too different from coding either.
In what way?
In the way that you're taking, particularly if you're using libraries and things like that, you're taking lots of bits of something and you're producing something completely different. So you're taking all these ingredients, so these different methods, these different variables and things like that. You're putting them together in just the right way to get the outcome you want. So it is a creative process in the same way.
I love that. Yeah, awesome. Oh, brilliant. Shout out your Twitter handles and all of that other jazz.
Oh, blimey. You're asking me now. So the Twitter handle is @Balfour74. I believe it's the same for LinkedIn as well. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think I've got open DM. So if anybody does want to contact me, you know, I don't have a problem with that at all. So yeah, those are probably the best ways to contact me.
Fantastic. I'll leave all of those in the show notes below as usual. Thank you ever so much, Jeremy, for coming on the show. And pleasure, I will say, have a happy holidays, because we're actually recording this before Christmas. So
yeah, just before Christmas as it happens.
Literally just before Christmas. But thank you ever so much. And I just want to say, for anyone who is learning to code, this year in 2020, we have a wonderful Discord community for How to Code Well. If you go to howtocodewell.net/Discord, you can join. You can join for free. We've got a coding challenges channel for coding challenges that I do every month. I will also review those live on Twitch as well and put them up on the website. And also there is a coding help channel too. So if you have any coding questions you want to ask, then please do join and ask away. It's a nice, friendly, comfortable environment for new developers and other developers of different skill levels. But anyway, happy coding. Speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye.